They mocked her worn combat boots the second she walked into the Northridge Veterans Affairs office, said she probably bought them at a surplus store to look tough. But when the fire alarm malfunctioned and chaos erupted, a 4-star general emerged from his meeting and immediately stood at attention, addressing her as Mom with the kind of respect reserved for legends. Because those boots weren't costume pieces, they were earned in the mountains of Afghanistan, and she wasn't just another veteran seeking benefits. She was the woman who held a firebase alone for 18 hours and saved an entire battalion. Want to know why 3 arrogant clerks learned the hardest lesson about respect they'd ever receive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Department of Veterans Affairs building in Northridge, Colorado, as Elena Vasquez pulled her 15-year-old Honda Civic into a space near the back. The building itself was a testament to government efficiency, all function, no form, with beige brick walls and windows that seemed designed to discourage lingering. It was the kind of place where hope came to wait in line, where bureaucracy wore the mask of public service, and where veterans learned that fighting for their country was sometimes easier than fighting for their benefits. Elena stepped out of her car, her movements deliberate and economic, the way people move when they've learned that wasted motion can mean the difference between life and death. At 38, she carried herself with a quiet authority that most people missed on first glance. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes, a plain gray sweater and dark jeans that had seen better days, but were clean and pressed with military precision. But it was her boots that told a different story. They were standard-issue combat boots, the kind issued to soldiers deploying to active war zones. The black leather was scuffed and worn, bearing the unmistakable patina of hard use in harsh conditions. The soles showed deep wear patterns, the kind that came from hundreds of miles walked across unforgiving terrain. Small scratches and scrapes marked the leather surface like a map of places most people would never see, experiences most people would never survive. These weren't fashion statements or surplus store purchases worn for effect. These were the boots of someone who had walked through fire and lived to tell about it. Elena shouldered her worn canvas messenger bag and walked toward the main entrance, her boots making soft, confident sounds against the asphalt. She'd been putting off this visit for months, but her disability claim had been denied twice, and her lawyer insisted that appearing in person might help move things along. She wasn't optimistic. The VA had a way of making even the most straightforward claims feel like battles, and she'd fought enough battles for one lifetime. The automatic doors slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss, revealing the familiar interior of a government building. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made everyone look either sick or exhausted. The air smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and the faint staleness of recycled air. Plastic chairs in various shades of blue and gray were arranged in neat rows, facing a reception desk that looked like it had been designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Behind the reception desk, 3 clerks huddled around a computer monitor, their conversation carrying the casual cruelty of people who had forgotten that their work involved real human beings with real problems. There was Bethany from intake processing, 26 years old with perfectly styled blonde hair and nails that suggested she'd never done anything more demanding than type complaint letters. Next to her stood Derek from case management, a man in his early 30s who wore his business casual attire like armor and had the soft look of someone whose biggest challenge was deciding where to eat lunch. The third was Amanda from Appeals Review, fresh out of college with a political science degree and the kind of confident ignorance that came from never having her assumptions tested by reality. Elena approached the desk, her messenger bag containing carefully organized files, documentation, and medical records that chronicled injuries sustained in service to her country. She'd learned to be prepared for these encounters, to have every piece of paper ready, every question anticipated. The VA was a maze of regulations and requirements, and she'd become an expert navigator out of necessity. "Elena Vasquez," she said clearly, addressing the three clerks who had barely looked up from their screen. "I have an 11 o'clock appointment regarding my disability appeal." Bethany glanced up with the kind of practiced smile that never reached her eyes, the expression of someone who processed dozens of cases daily and had long since stopped seeing individual people behind the paperwork. "Right, let me pull up your file," she said, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. Derek, however, was focused on something else entirely. His gaze had drifted down to Elena's feet, and a smirk was beginning to form at the corners of his mouth. "Nice boots," he said, his tone carrying just enough sarcasm to make his meaning clear. "Going for the full military cosplay look today?" Amanda looked over and snorted softly. "Oh wow, actual combat boots. How authentic. Probably picked them up at Army-Navy surplus for like $20. I'm betting she watched a few war movies and decided she needed to look the part," Derek added, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned his own assumptions. "You know how it is, some people think wearing the gear makes them look legitimate." Elena's expression didn't change. She'd heard worse, had faced real enemies who had tried to break her with more than words. These three clerks, with their soft hands and comfortable assumptions, were barely worth acknowledgement. But she noted their names from their desk plates, filed away their faces, and waited for Bethany to finish pulling up her file. "Here we go," Bethany said, squinting at her screen. "Elena Vasquez, disability appeal, multiple injuries sustained during deployment." She paused, her expression shifting slightly as more information populated her screen. Something in the details was giving her pause, but she continued with her routine processing. "You'll need to take a seat in the waiting area. Someone will call your name when it's your turn." Elena nodded once and turned toward the seating area, her worn combat boots making soft sounds against the polished linoleum floor. Behind her, she could hear the three clerks resuming their conversation, their voices carrying the casual dismissal of people who thought they had sized up the situation completely. "Seriously though," Derek was saying, "what is it with people thinking they need to dress up like soldiers when they come in here? Like we're going to be more impressed by their costume choices? It's actually kind of sad," Amanda added. "Like, she's trying so hard to convince us she's legitimate that she's wearing props." Elena found a seat in the third row and sat down, placing her messenger bag on the chair beside her. She didn't look back at the reception desk, didn't give any indication that she'd heard their comments. She'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, and that the most powerful response was often no response at all. But as she sat there, organizing her paperwork one final time, her boots planted firmly on the institutional carpet, she couldn't help but remember the last time someone had questioned their authenticity. It had been in a different kind of office, in a different kind of building, where a different kind of authority figure had looked at those same boots and immediately understood exactly what they represented. The morning was about to become much more interesting than any of them anticipated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Northridge Department of Veterans Affairs building had been constructed in 1987, during an era when government architecture prioritized efficiency over comfort. The main lobby stretched 40 feet from the entrance to the service windows, with a ceiling high enough to accommodate the institutional fluorescent lighting that bathed everything in harsh, unflattering brightness. The walls were painted in that particular shade of beige that seemed designed to discourage lingering, not quite white, not quite tan, but something in between that managed to drain color from everything it touched. The floor was polished linoleum, in a mottled pattern meant to hide scuff marks and wear, though decades of foot traffic had worn pathways from the entrance to the various service windows. The pattern reminded visitors that this was a place of transit, somewhere people came to conduct business and leave, not somewhere anyone was meant to feel comfortable or welcome. Industrial-grade carpet tiles in muted blue covered the seating area, their edges slightly raised where they'd begun to separate from years of heavy use. The chairs themselves were standard government-issue molded plastic seats in alternating shades of navy and gray, connected by metal frames that had been painted and repainted so many times that the original color was anyone's guess. They were arranged in perfectly straight rows facing the service windows, like church pews designed by someone who had never attended a service. The air circulation system hummed constantly in the background, a white noise that mixed with the soft clicking of keyboards, the rustle of paperwork, and the occasional ring of telephones that always seemed to go unanswered for just a few seconds too long. The building's climate control maintained a temperature that was never quite right, too warm in winter, too cold in summer, as if the system had been calibrated for efficiency rather than human comfort. Above the service windows, a series of digital displays showed numbers in red LED, the current ticket being served, and the estimated wait time that everyone knew was wildly optimistic. The displays had the worn look of technology that had been state-of-the-art in the early 2000s, but was now simply functional enough to avoid replacement. Next to them, faded posters reminded visitors of various veteran benefits and services. Their edges curled from age and humidity. The reception area was separated from the rest of the building by a wall of reinforced glass, the kind used in banks and government buildings, where security was a constant consideration. The glass was marked with fingerprints and breath fog despite regular cleaning, a testament to the thousands of veterans who had pressed their faces close to speak through the small, circular openings that allowed conversation with the clerks. On the other side, behind the glass, the clerks worked at workstations that looked like they'd been assembled from catalog parts, beige metal desks, black computer monitors, and adjustable office chairs that had seen better days. The workspace was cramped but organized, with filing cabinets lining the walls and stacks of paperwork that seemed to multiply even as they were processed. Coffee cups and personal items dotted the desks, small attempts to humanize a space that felt designed to discourage human connection. The morning light filtered through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, creating rectangles of dusty illumination that moved slowly across the floor as the sun climbed higher. Outside, the parking lot stretched toward a strip mall that housed a check-cashing service, a dollar store, and a sandwich shop, the kind of businesses that clustered around government buildings, feeding off the steady stream of people who had nowhere else to go for essential services. The building sat on what had once been farmland, back when Northridge was a smaller community surrounded by agricultural fields. Now it was part of the suburban sprawl that had grown up around Denver, connected to the larger city by highways and strip malls, but still maintaining the feel of a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The VA office served veterans from a 3-county area, drawing people from small mountain towns and suburban developments alike. Inside the lobby, the sounds were muffled and institutional. Conversations were conducted in low voices, partly out of respect for privacy, and partly because the space seemed to demand a certain level of reverence. The click of keyboards was constant, punctuated by the soft thump of stamps approving or denying claims, the rustle of papers being shuffled and filed, and the occasional buzz of the security door that led to the inner offices where the real decisions were made. The smell was distinctly governmental, a mixture of industrial cleaning products, old paperwork, and the faint mustiness that came from air that had been circulated and recirculated through decades of bureaucratic proceedings. It was the smell of patience tested, of hopes deferred, of a system that moved at its own pace, regardless of the urgency of the people it served. This was the environment where Elena Vasquez now found herself, sitting in a molded plastic chair, with her carefully organized paperwork and her worn combat boots that had carried her through places these walls had never seen. The building around her hummed with the quiet efficiency of bureaucracy, processing cases and claims with the mechanical precision of a system designed more for consistency than compassion. And in this sterile, institutional setting, where everything was designed to maintain order and discourage disruption, something was about to happen that would shatter the carefully maintained routine and remind everyone present that some stories couldn't be contained by filing systems or explained by paperwork. Elena settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair with the kind of practiced patience that spoke of countless hours spent waiting in similar institutional settings. Her posture was naturally straight, not the forced rigidity of someone trying to make an impression, but the unconscious alignment of someone whose spine had been trained to maintain proper form under any circumstances. She placed her messenger bag on the adjacent chair with deliberate care, ensuring it wouldn't slide to the floor or interfere with other waiting veterans. Her hands, resting calmly on her knees, told their own story to anyone observant enough to read the signs. The skin was marked with small scars, thin white lines across her knuckles, a curved mark on her palm that suggested contact with sharp metal under pressure, calluses in places that spoke of handling equipment most people never touched. Her nails were short and practical, maintained for function rather than appearance, bearing none of the polish or decoration that might interfere with serious work. The messenger bag itself was a study in organized efficiency. Made of heavy canvas that had faded from dark green to a weathered olive color, it showed signs of extensive use but meticulous care. The strap had been repaired with military-grade stitching, small reinforcements that suggested someone who understood the value of reliable equipment. Inside, barely visible through the partially open flap, manila folders were arranged with the kind of precision that came from experience with systems where misplaced paperwork could have serious consequences. Elena's clothing choices reflected someone who had learned to dress for comfort and practicality rather than impression. The gray sweater was wool, well made but not expensive, chosen for its ability to regulate temperature and resist wrinkles rather than its fashion appeal. The jeans were dark wash, fitted properly but not fashionably tight, with reinforced seams that suggested they'd been purchased with durability in mind. Everything about her appearance spoke of someone who made decisions based on functionality and long-term value rather than momentary trends, but it was in her observational habits that her true nature became most apparent to those who knew what to look for. While appearing to focus on organizing her paperwork, Elena's eyes made regular sweeps of the room, cataloging the positions of other people, noting the locations of exits, registering changes in the ambient noise level that might indicate shifting circumstances. These weren't the nervous glances of someone anxious about their appointment. They were the automatic awareness patterns of someone who had learned that situational awareness was a survival skill. When the elderly veteran in the front row struggled to retrieve a dropped pen, Elena rose smoothly and retrieved it for him, handing it over with a brief nod and a quiet "Here you go, sir," that carried genuine respect. The interaction lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it revealed someone who noticed when others needed assistance and provided it, without fanfare or expectation of recognition. The old man looked up at her with surprised gratitude, and something in his eyes suggested he recognized a kindred spirit. Though he couldn't quite place what seemed familiar about her presence, Elena's voice, when she spoke, carried the clear diction of someone accustomed to communicating in noisy environments where precise language could mean the difference between success and disaster. There was no regional accent, no verbal tics or filler words, just clean, economical speech that conveyed information efficiently. When the veteran thanked her, she simply nodded once and returned to her seat, The brief interaction handled with the same calm competence she brought to everything else. Her breathing was notably controlled, the deep, measured rhythm of someone who had learned to manage stress through disciplined respiratory patterns. Under pressure, while most people's breathing became shallow and rapid, Elena's remained steady and purposeful. This wasn't meditation or relaxation technique. It was the automatic response of someone whose training had integrated stress management into their fundamental operating systems. The way she handled her paperwork revealed additional layers of her character. Each document was reviewed briefly but thoroughly before being returned to its proper folder. Her fingers moved across the pages with the light touch of someone who understood that important papers required careful handling. She made small notations in the margins with a blue pen, checking items off mental lists and adding clarifications that would help whoever reviewed her case understand the context behind the medical terminology and incident reports. Most revealing of all was Elena's relationship with time. Unlike the other veterans in the waiting area, who checked their phones constantly or showed visible frustration with the delay, she seemed to exist in a state of patient readiness. Not passive waiting, but active preparation, the mindset of someone who understood that the next phase of any operation began when circumstances allowed, not when you wanted them to. She was ready to proceed at any moment, but equally prepared to wait as long as necessary. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band worn thin from years of wear, told another story. It had been sized down at least once, suggesting weight loss, and the metal showed the kind of patina that came from being worn in environments where precious metals faced challenges beyond normal daily wear. She touched it occasionally, an unconscious gesture that spoke of someone for whom certain connections remained constant even when everything else in life had changed. The combat boots that had drawn the clerks' attention were integrated into her appearance so naturally that they seemed like the obvious choice rather than a statement. They were laced with the kind of precision that suggested muscle memory, each loop identical, the final knot positioned exactly where it needed to be for maximum security and easy release. The leather had been treated and maintained despite its obvious age, showing the care of someone who understood that reliable footwear was essential equipment rather than mere clothing. When Elena shifted position, her movements were economical and fluid, suggesting someone whose body had been trained to move efficiently under various conditions. There was no wasted motion, no fidgeting or restlessness. She simply existed in the space she occupied with the kind of centered presence that comes from having been tested in situations where alertness and self-control were survival requirements. As the morning progressed and other veterans were called for their appointments, Elena remained constant patient, prepared, and quietly confident. She wasn't rehearsing what she would say or reviewing her strategy for the upcoming meeting. She was simply ready, with the kind of readiness that suggested this appointment, however important it might be for her personal circumstances, was far from the most challenging situation she had ever faced. The clerks behind the reinforced glass continued their casual conversation, occasionally glancing toward the waiting area, but showing no indication that they understood they were in the presence of someone whose story would challenge every assumption they had made about who belonged in that building and why. Behind the reinforced glass partition, the three clerks had settled into their mid-morning routine with the comfortable familiarity of people who had performed the same tasks hundreds of times before. Their workspace buzzed with the low-level energy of a government office hitting its stride, keyboards clicking in steady rhythm, phones ringing with the persistence of bureaucratic necessity, and the soft shuffle of paperwork being processed. Through the endless machinery of veteran services, Bethany Caldwell occupied the center workstation, her domain marked by a collection of personal items that spoke to her carefully curated self-image. A motivational calendar featuring kittens hung at eye level, each month offering inspirational quotes about persistence and positive thinking. Her desk was adorned with a small succulent garden in matching ceramic pots, a photo of herself at last year's office Christmas party, and a coffee mug that proclaimed "World's Greatest Problem Solver" in cheerful pink lettering. At 26, she had worked at the VA for 3 years, long enough to consider herself experienced, but not long enough to understand the weight of the decisions that passed across her desk daily. Bethany's appearance was maintenance-intensive, in the way that suggested significant time and money invested in looking professional. Her blonde hair was styled in loose waves that required daily attention. Her makeup was applied with the precision of someone who watched YouTube tutorials religiously, and her nails featured an intricate design that had cost more than many veterans spent on groceries in a week. She wore business casual clothing from mid-range department stores, carefully chosen to project competence while staying within her government salary budget. Her approach to work reflected someone who had learned to navigate bureaucracy without ever questioning its fundamental assumptions. She processed claims with efficient accuracy, following established procedures with the kind of reliability that kept the system functioning smoothly. But her understanding of the human stories behind the paperwork remained abstract: numbers to be verified, boxes to be checked, forms to be approved or denied based on criteria that existed in computer databases rather than real-world experience. Derek Richardson commanded the workstation to her left, his area reflecting the personality of someone who took pride in his perceived authority within the system. His desk featured a small nameplate that read "Case Management Specialist" in official-looking gold lettering, positioned prominently where visitors could see his title clearly. Surrounding it were symbols of his perceived expertise: a thick binder of regulations that he consulted frequently, a dual monitor setup that made his work appear more complex than it actually was, and a coffee mug featuring the seal of his alma mater, where he had earned a business administration degree that he considered preparation for understanding military service. At 32, Derek had been with the VA for 5 years, having started immediately after college when the federal benefits package seemed like a smart career choice. He had developed the confident bearing of someone who confused familiarity with procedures for actual expertise about the people those procedures were meant to serve. His clothing choices leaned toward the formal end of business casual pressed slacks, button-down shirts with subtle patterns, and ties that he considered essential for projecting professional authority even when they weren't required. Derek's worldview was shaped by his belief that military service was essentially another form of government employment, with veterans being former government workers seeking continued benefits, rather than people who had faced unique challenges in service to their country. He approached disability claims with the mindset of someone preventing fraud, rather than someone helping heroes access earned benefits. His questions were designed to catch inconsistencies rather than understand circumstances, and his default assumption was skepticism rather than support. Amanda Foster occupied the rightmost workstation, her space reflecting the energy of someone who considered this position a stepping stone to bigger things rather than a career destination. Fresh out of Colorado State University with a political science degree, she had taken the VA job as a way to gain government experience while she prepared for graduate school applications. Her desk featured law school brochures, LSAT prep books, and a calendar counting down to application deadlines, making it clear that she viewed veteran services as temporary employment rather than meaningful work. At 24, Amanda possessed the particular form of confidence that came from academic success, combined with complete lack of real-world testing. She had written undergraduate papers about military policy and veteran integration, approaching these topics with the theoretical framework of someone who had read extensively about war without ever meeting anyone who had actually experienced it. Her understanding of military service was filtered through political science textbooks and documentary films, creating a worldview where veterans were statistical populations rather than individual human beings with complex stories. Amanda's appearance reflected someone still transitioning from college to professional life: business attire that looked slightly costume-like, as if she were playing the role of a government employee rather than actually being one. Her makeup was applied with the heavy hand of someone still learning professional norms, and her jewelry choices suggested someone who equated expensive accessories with credibility. She spoke in the measured tones of someone who had learned that slow, deliberate speech could mask inexperience as thoughtfulness. The dynamic between the three clerks had developed over months of shared work, creating a social hierarchy based on tenure and perceived expertise rather than actual knowledge or compassion. Derek considered himself the leader of their informal group, drawing authority from his longer service and male confidence. Bethany served as the social connector, maintaining relationships and facilitating the kind of casual conversation that made long days pass more easily. Amanda played the role of ambitious newcomer, asking questions that allowed the others to demonstrate their supposed expertise, while positioning herself as someone destined for more important work. Their conversation patterns had become predictable. Derek would make observations about cases or people. Bethany would add supportive commentary that reinforced group cohesion, and Amanda would contribute academic-sounding analysis that impressed her colleagues while revealing her fundamental disconnect from the reality of veteran experiences. Together, they had created an echo chamber where their assumptions about military service and veteran needs went unchallenged, reinforced by their shared belief that their college educations and government positions qualified them to judge the legitimacy of people whose experiences lay far outside their understanding. This morning's discussion about Elena's combat boots fit perfectly into their established pattern of casual dismissal. They had processed hundreds of veteran cases, reviewed thousands of documents, and answered countless questions about benefits and procedures. But they had never been forced to confront the reality that some of the people seeking their services had stories that would fundamentally challenge their comfortable assumptions about who deserved respect and why. The morning was about to provide them with an education that no government training manual could have prepared them for. Delivered by someone whose worn combat boots had walked through places they couldn't imagine, whose quiet presence carried authority they were completely unprepared to recognize. The morning routine was disrupted when Derek's computer system flagged Elena's file for additional documentation. A red notification appeared on his screen, indicating that her disability rating request required supervisory review due to complexity of her claimed injuries. Derek leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed his suspicions were being validated by the system itself. Well, he said, loud enough for his colleagues to hear. Looks like our fashion-forward veteran over there has quite the ambitious claim. Systems flagging it for potential inconsistencies. Bethany rolled her chair closer to Derek's workstation, her curiosity piqued by the prospect of office drama. What kind of inconsistencies? She asked, her voice carrying the eager tone of someone hungry for gossip that would break up the monotony of the morning. Derek scrolled through Elena's file with deliberate slowness, making a show of his supposed expertise in identifying problematic claims. Multiple injury categories, psychological trauma, combat-related disabilities spanning several years of service. And get this, she's claiming conditions related to sustained combat operations in hostile territory. He emphasized the last phrase with air quotes, his tone dripping with skepticism. Sustained combat operations? Amanda looked up from her LSAT prep book with the expression of someone who had found an interesting case study. That sounds pretty dramatic. What branch was she in? Army, Derek replied, continuing to scroll through the digital file. But here's the thing, look at her discharge date. She's been out for almost 6 years, and she's just now filing for disability benefits. That doesn't add up. If someone really had all these serious injuries from combat, wouldn't they have filed immediately? Bethany nodded knowingly, her expression reflecting someone who thought she had identified a pattern. You're absolutely right. The legitimate cases usually come through the system right away. People who wait years to file are usually the ones who've had time to research what conditions pay the most. Amanda closed her prep book and moved closer to join the conversation, drawn by the opportunity to apply her academic theories to a real-world situation. From a policy perspective, delayed filing is often associated with fraudulent claims. I wrote a paper about this in my public administration class. Veterans who genuinely suffered service-connected disabilities typically seek help immediately because they need the support. Derek printed out several pages from Elena's file and spread them across his desk like evidence in a case he was building. Look at this medical documentation. Multiple doctors, multiple facilities, treatment records spanning years. Either she's genuinely hurt, or she's put a lot of effort into building a convincing paper trail. Or, Bethany said with the tone of someone who believed she had solved a puzzle. She's one of those people who shops around for doctors willing to support their claims. I've seen cases where people visit dozens of medical professionals until they find ones who'll document whatever conditions they're claiming. Amanda nodded enthusiastically, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate her academic knowledge. There's actually a term for that in the literature, claim shopping. It's when individuals systematically seek medical opinions that support predetermined disability narratives rather than seeking genuine treatment for actual conditions. Derek stood up and walked to the reinforced glass partition, looking out at Elena with the expression of someone who believed he had figured out her angle. "Just look at her," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who thought his judgment was being validated. Sitting there with her perfectly organized paperwork, wearing those ridiculous boots like she's still deployed somewhere. The whole thing screams performance. "The boots are definitely overkill," Bethany agreed, following Derek's gaze. "I mean, if you're really a veteran, you don't need to advertise it with costume pieces. Genuine military people I've met tend to dress normally when they're dealing with civilian services." Amanda joined them at the partition, studying Elena with the analytical gaze of someone applying theoretical frameworks to a living situation. It's actually a classic case of what we call military identity persistence. Some people have difficulty transitioning to civilian life and continue to present themselves in military terms, even when it's no longer appropriate or necessary. Derek tapped the glass lightly with his pen, a gesture that was both dismissive and territorial. The real veterans who come through here, the ones with genuine service-connected disabilities, they're usually pretty humble about it. They don't show up looking like they're heading to a war zone. They just want their benefits processed quietly and efficiently. "Exactly," Bethany said, warming to the theme. "The people who really served in combat zones usually want to put that experience behind them, not advertise it with their fashion choices. Wearing combat boots to a VA appointment is like wearing a uniform to a job interview. It's trying too hard to make a point." Amanda pulled out her phone and quickly typed a note to herself, seeing academic potential in the observation. "This could actually be useful for my graduate school application essay. The Psychology of Veteran Identity Performance versus Authentic Military Experience." It's exactly the kind of real-world application of policy theory that admissions committees love to see. Derek returned to his desk and began preparing what he clearly considered a thorough challenge to Elena's claim. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, with the authority of someone who believed he was protecting the system from fraud. "When we call her up, we're going to ask detailed questions about her service record. Specific dates, unit designations, deployment locations. People who are faking military experience usually can't handle detailed questioning about the specifics." "That's smart," Bethany said approvingly. "Real veterans know their service details by heart. They can tell you exactly where they were stationed, who their commanding officers were, what their daily responsibilities involved. People who are making things up usually give vague answers or get defensive when you ask for specifics." Amanda had returned to her workstation but continued listening to the conversation while taking notes. You should also ask about military terminology and procedures, she suggested. Genuine military personnel use specific language patterns and reference systems that are difficult to fake convincingly. It's like a professional dialect that civilians can't usually replicate accurately. Derek smiled with the satisfaction of someone who believed he was about to expose a fraud. Oh, I've got plenty of questions ready. And if her answers don't add up, if she can't provide convincing details about her supposed combat experience, then we'll know we're dealing with someone who's trying to game the system. The boots are going to be so embarrassing for her when she can't back up her story, Bethany said with barely concealed anticipation. Imagine showing up dressed like G.I. Jane and then not being able to answer basic questions about military service. It's going to be like showing up to a costume party in the wrong outfit. Amanda looked up from her note-taking with the expression of someone who had found the perfect case study. This is actually fascinating from a sociological perspective. The intersection of identity performance, government benefits, and social validation. She's not just trying to get disability payments, she's trying to claim membership in a community she may not actually belong to. Derek gathered Elena's paperwork into a neat stack and placed it prominently on his desk, like evidence he was preparing to present. Well, she's about to find out that wearing the costume doesn't make you the character. We'll see how well her little performance holds up under actual scrutiny. The three clerks had worked themselves into a state of confident anticipation, convinced that they had identified a fraud and were about to expose it. Their shared assumptions had created a narrative that fit their preconceptions about military service, disability claims, and the kind of people who deserved government benefits. They had no idea that they were about to encounter someone whose story would shatter every assumption they had made and leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about service, sacrifice, and the difference between appearance and reality. As the clerks continued their whispered analysis behind the glass partition, Elena remained seated in the waiting area, apparently absorbed in reviewing her documentation. But for those who knew how to read the signs, subtle changes in her behavior suggested that she was aware of the scrutiny and had begun responding to it in ways that revealed far more about her true nature than her observers realized. Her posture had shifted almost imperceptibly, moving from relaxed patience to what military personnel would recognize as condition yellow, a state of relaxed alertness where someone remains calm and approachable while maintaining heightened awareness of their environment. The change was so subtle that the clerks, focused on their conspiracy theories, missed it entirely. But the elderly veteran in the front row, whose own military instincts had been sharpened by decades of experience, noticed the shift and found himself paying closer attention to the woman with the worn combat boots. Elena's hands, previously resting casually on her paperwork, now moved with a different quality of precision. When she turned pages, her fingers displayed the kind of controlled dexterity that spoke of extensive training, with equipment that required absolute accuracy. Under pressure, the way she handled her pen when making notations revealed muscle memory patterns that civilian occupations simply didn't develop. The grip, the pressure, the economical movement that came from writing reports and conditions where legibility could be a matter of life and death. Most revealing of all was how Elena organized her documentation in response to sensing hostile scrutiny. Rather than becoming defensive or nervous, she began arranging her papers with the systematic precision of someone preparing for a formal inspection. Each document was positioned exactly where it needed to be, creating a presentation that was simultaneously thorough and immediately accessible. This wasn't the frantic organization of someone worried about being caught in deception. It was the methodical preparation of someone who had learned that being thoroughly prepared was the best response to any challenge. When Elena reached into her messenger bag to retrieve an additional folder, the movement revealed something that none of the watching clerks were positioned to see clearly, but which caught the attention of two other veterans in the waiting area. On the inside of her wrist, just visible for a moment as her sleeve shifted, was a small tattoo that consisted of numbers and letters in a very specific format. To civilian eyes, it would have appeared to be a random sequence of characters. But to military personnel familiar with unit designations and deployment codes, those characters told a very different story. The veteran sitting 2 rows behind Elena, a middle-aged man wearing a V, a hospital bracelet, and leaning heavily on a cane, caught sight of the tattoo and felt his breath catch in his throat. The sequence he glimpsed was not standard military notation. It was something far more specific and far more significant. Those particular combinations of numbers and letters were used only by units that operated in classified environments, in places that didn't officially exist, on missions that were never recorded in standard military documentation. Elena's phone, which she had kept in silent mode throughout her wait, began vibrating against the table where she had placed it. The caller ID showed only a number, no name, but Elena's response to seeing it was immediate and telling. Her already controlled breathing became even more regulated, and she answered the call with a single word spoken so quietly that even nearby veterans couldn't hear what she said. The conversation that followed was conducted in monosyllables on her end. Yes. Number, understood, confirmed, the kind of communication pattern used by people accustomed to conveying maximum information with minimum exposure. During the brief phone call, Elena's free hand moved unconsciously to touch the spot where her combat boots met her ankle, a gesture so automatic that she clearly wasn't aware of making it. But the movement caused her pant leg to shift slightly, revealing something that would have been shocking to anyone who understood military insignia and decorations. Permanently tattooed around her ankle, in intricate detail, was the design of a medal that most military personnel would recognize immediately, but would never expect to see on someone sitting quietly in a VA waiting room. The call ended as abruptly as it had begun, with Elena simply closing the phone and returning it to its previous position. But the brief interruption had subtly changed the atmosphere in the waiting room. The 2 veterans who had caught glimpses of her tattoos were now studying her, with the kind of focused attention that came from recognizing signs they hadn't expected to encounter. Their body language shifted from casual waiting to something approaching respectful attention, though they remained careful not to stare or make their observations obvious. Elena's response to ending the phone call revealed another layer of her training and experience. Rather than showing any sign of stress or distraction from whatever conversation had just concluded, she immediately returned her full attention to her paperwork with the kind of compartmentalization that spoke of someone who had learned to separate different operational concerns completely. Whatever the call had been about, and its official, abbreviated nature suggested it was related to ongoing responsibilities rather than personal matters. It had no visible impact on her preparation for the upcoming appointment. The way Elena checked the time on her watch told its own story. Rather than the casual glance that most people use to monitor their schedule, she performed what military personnel would recognize as a time hack, a precise noting of the exact minute that was used to coordinate activities requiring split-second timing. The gesture was so automatic that it was clearly a deeply ingrained habit, the kind that developed from operations where being 30 seconds off schedule could have catastrophic consequences. Behind the glass partition, Derek had returned to his workstation and was preparing to call Elena's name, confident in his plan to expose what he believed to be fraudulent claims. But he was so focused on his prepared questions and assumptions that he missed the visual cues that were becoming increasingly apparent to the military veterans in the waiting area. The worn combat boots that he dismissed as costume pieces were being recognized by people with actual military experience as equipment that had seen serious use in serious places. Bethany had printed out additional forms that she believed would trip up someone making false claims about military service. Forms that required specific knowledge of military procedures and terminology. She arranged them on her desk with the satisfied expression of someone who thought she was setting a trap that would expose deception. Amanda had prepared what she considered penetrating questions based on her academic study of military culture. Questions that she believed would reveal inconsistencies in Elena's story. None of the three clerks had noticed that the atmosphere in the waiting room had begun to change as other veterans started recognizing signs that suggested the quiet woman with the organized paperwork and worn combat boots might be someone whose story was far more significant than her humble appearance indicated. The mystery was deepening, but not in the direction the clerks expected. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal just how completely wrong their assumptions had been, and how much they had misunderstood about the person they were. Preparing to challenge, Derek straightened his tie and approached the microphone at his workstation with the confidence of someone who believed he was about to conduct a masterful interrogation. He had spent the last 20 minutes reviewing Elena's file and preparing what he considered to be penetrating questions that would expose the inconsistencies in her story. The anticipation was evident in his posture as he cleared his throat and called out across the waiting room. "Elena Vasquez," he announced, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone who believed he held all the cards in the upcoming interaction. "Please approach window 3 for your appointment." Elena rose from her chair with fluid economy, gathering her paperwork and messenger bag in movements that were both graceful and efficient. As she walked toward the service window, several of the other veterans in the waiting area watched her approach with the kind of attention that suggested they were beginning to suspect this interaction might be more significant than the routine benefit appointment it appeared to be. "Good morning," Elena said as she reached Derek's window, her voice carrying the clear diction and respectful tone of someone who understood proper protocol for official interactions. She placed her documentation on the counter with careful precision, each folder positioned exactly where it needed to be for easy access. Derek leaned back in his chair with studied casualness, a posture designed to project authority while suggesting that he was in complete control of the situation. "Ms. Vasquez," he began, deliberately using the civilian title rather than any military rank, "I've been reviewing your disability claim, and I have to say it's quite extensive. Multiple injuries, psychological trauma, combat-related conditions, spanning several years of service." "Yes," Elena replied simply, offering no elaboration or defensive explanation. Derek consulted his notes with theatrical precision, making a show of his thoroughness. "The thing is, some of these claims seem a bit ambitious. Sustained combat operations, hostile territory engagement, injuries consistent with extended battlefield exposure. These are pretty serious allegations." "They're not allegations," Elena sighed quietly. "They're documented medical conditions resulting from confirmed combat experiences." Bethany leaned forward at her adjacent workstation, eager to watch Derek's interrogation unfold. Amanda had positioned herself where she could observe the interaction while appearing to work on other tasks, her academic curiosity piqued by what she expected to be a textbook example of claim fraud being exposed. Derek smiled with the satisfaction of someone who thought he had identified a weakness in Elena's presentation. "Well, let's talk specifics then. According to your file, you claim to have served in Afghanistan from 2018 to 2020. Can you tell me the exact designation of your unit during that deployment?" "3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, Alpha Company." Elena replied without hesitation, her voice carrying the automatic precision of someone reciting information that was permanently embedded in their memory. Derek's confidence flickered slightly, but he pressed forward with his prepared questions. "And your commanding officer during that period?" "Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell for the first 18 months, then Colonel Sarah Chun after his rotation stateside." Amanda looked up from her pretend work, surprised by the specificity and immediate nature of Elena's responses. These weren't the vague, hesitant answers she had expected from someone making false claims about military service. Derek consulted his notes again, searching for questions that might trip her up. What was your primary military occupational specialty? 1B Infantry, with additional qualifications in combat medical aid, explosive ordnance disposal, and forward observer operations. The elderly veteran in the front row of the waiting area had turned completely around in his chair and was now watching the interaction with undisguised fascination. The combination of unit designation and specialties that Elena had just rattled off told a story that was becoming increasingly impressive to anyone with actual military knowledge. Derek was beginning to realize that his interrogation wasn't proceeding as planned, but his commitment to exposing what he believed to be fraud kept him pushing forward. "These combat boots you're wearing," he said, gesturing toward her feet with what he intended to be a dismissive wave. "Where exactly did you acquire them?" Elena looked down at her boots briefly, then back up at Derek with an expression that remained perfectly calm, but somehow carried new weight. "They were issued to me at Fort Benning in March 2018, before my first deployment. I've worn them through 3 combat tours, 2 emergency medical evacuations, and approximately 400 combat patrols in the Kunar province." The specificity of her answer hung in the air like a challenge. Bethany had stopped pretending to work on other tasks and was now staring openly at Elena, beginning to sense that something about this interaction was not developing according to their expectations. Derek, feeling increasingly uncertain but unwilling to abandon his position, decided to press what he thought was his strongest argument. "The thing is, Ms. Vasquez, the timing of your claim filing raises some red flags. You've been out of service for 6 years, and you're just now seeking disability benefits. Don't you think that's a little convenient?" Elena's response came without defensiveness or anger, delivered in the same calm, factual tone she had maintained throughout the interrogation. "I was assigned to classified operations for the final 3 years of my service. My medical records were sealed pending security reviews. The paperwork required to declassify my treatment history and make it available for VA processing was completed 8 months ago." The words "classified operations" hit the waiting room like a physical presence. The veteran with the cane had leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from casual interest to something approaching awe. Another veteran, a woman in her 40s wearing a Navy veteran cap, had put down her magazine entirely and was now watching Elena with the kind of focused attention reserved for people who commanded respect. Amanda found herself taking notes without realizing it, her academic assumptions about military identity performance beginning to crumble as Elena's responses revealed layers of experience that couldn't be faked or researched in textbooks. Derek made one final attempt to regain control of the interaction, his voice carrying a slight edge of desperation. "Look, I'm just trying to verify the legitimacy of these claims. Combat operations, classified missions, specialized training, it all sounds pretty dramatic for someone who—" Elena interrupted him, not rudely but with quiet authority that cut through his stammering. "Derek Richardson, case management specialist, bachelor's degree in business administration from Colorado State University. Hired by the VA in 2019. You've never served in the military, never been deployed overseas, and never been in a situation where your life depended on the reliability of your equipment or the competence of your training." Derek's face went pale. The information Elena had just recited wasn't publicly available. It was the kind of detailed background that suggested access to personnel databases and security clearances far beyond anything a typical veteran would possess. "How did you ... Derek began, but Elena continued speaking. "The boots you've been questioning aren't fashion accessories or surplus store purchases. They're Belleville 790 waterproof flight and combat boots, manufactured specifically for military personnel engaged in hostile environment operations. The wear patterns on the solace indicate approximately 800 miles of movement across rocky terrain under load. The scuff marks on the toe caps are consistent with tactical breaching operations. The repair work on the left ankle area was done in a forward operating base using military-grade materials because replacement wasn't available during active operations. The waiting room had gone completely silent. Even the background noise of other government activities seemed muted as Elena's calm, precise analysis demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond anything a civilian could fake or research. Bethany and Amanda had stopped all pretense of working and were staring at Elena with expressions that suggested they were beginning to understand that they had seriously misjudged the situation they were dealing with. The silence that followed, Elena's technical analysis of her own combat boots stretched across the waiting room like a physical presence, broken only by the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of air circulation systems. Derek sat frozen at his workstation, his prepared questions forgotten, his confidence shattered by the realization that he had walked into a confrontation he was completely unprepared for. Bethany's hands had stopped moving across her keyboard entirely, her fingers suspended over keys as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. The motivational calendar featuring kittens suddenly seemed absurd in the context of someone casually discussing tactical breaching operations and forward operating base repairs. Her carefully maintained professional image felt fragile and inadequate next to Elena's quiet demonstration of real expertise. Amanda had abandoned all pretense of working on other tasks and was staring openly at Elena with the expression of someone watching their academic theories crumble in real time. Her political science textbooks had discussed military culture in abstract terms, but nothing in her educational background had prepared her for encountering someone who spoke about classified operations and tactical equipment with the casual precision of lived experience. The elderly veteran in the front row had turned completely around in his chair and was studying Elena with the kind of focused attention that spoke of recognition dawning. His weathered hands gripped the handle of his cane with white-knuckled intensity, and his eyes held the particular quality of respect that came from understanding exactly what kind of person he was looking at. Behind him, the woman in the Navy veteran cap had removed her reading glasses and was leaning forward in her chair, her magazine forgotten on the floor beside her. She had spent enough time around military personnel to recognize the signs of someone whose service record was far more significant than their humble appearance suggested. The way Elena had recited Derek's background information spoke of security clearances and access levels that were reserved for very specific types of operations. Derek finally found his voice, though it came out smaller and less confident than he intended. I don't understand how you could know my personal information. That's not available in public records. Elena's response was delivered with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the interaction, but now it carried an undertone that suggested depths of capability that the clerks were only beginning to glimpse. Personnel security assessments are routine for anyone seeking to verify the legitimacy of individuals processing sensitive military information. Your background check was completed in approximately 47 seconds using resources available to personnel with appropriate clearance levels. The implications of that statement hit the room like a series of shock waves. Amanda felt her understanding of government security protocols completely realign as she realized that Elena possessed access to databases and resources that were far beyond anything a typical veteran would have. Her academic assumptions about military hierarchy and information access were being systematically dismantled by someone who operated at levels she hadn't known existed. Bethany's coffee mug, the one proclaiming her to be the world's greatest problem solver, seemed to mock her from its position on her desk as she realized that she was facing a problem she had no framework for understanding. The woman she had dismissed as someone playing dress-up with surplus store combat boots was demonstrating capabilities that suggested ongoing involvement in operations that required the highest levels of security clearance. Derek made a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of authority over the situation. Look, regardless of whatever this is about, I still need to process your disability claim according to established procedures. The fact remains that some of these medical conditions seem inconsistent with standard deployment experiences. Elena reached into her messenger bag and withdrew a folder that she hadn't opened during their previous discussion. The movement was deliberate and controlled, suggesting that she had been holding this documentation in reserve for exactly this moment. These are declassified medical records from Walter Reed Medical Center, documenting treatment for injuries sustained during Operation Mountain Resolve in the Kunar province. She placed the folder on the counter and opened it to reveal medical documentation that was immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with military healthcare systems. The letterhead bore the official seal of Walter Reed, and the classification markings at the top and bottom of each page indicated that these documents had recently been downgraded from restricted access. The veteran with the cane had managed to position himself where he could see the papers Elena was displaying, and his sharp intake of breath was audible across the waiting room. Operation Mountain Resolve was not a mission that appeared in public military records or media coverage. It was the kind of operation that military personnel heard about only in whispered conversations and classified briefings. These records document treatment for injuries sustained during an 18-hour defensive action, Elena continued, her voice maintaining the same factual tone while describing events that were clearly anything but routine. Shrapnel wounds from multiple IED explosions, smoke inhalation from sustained artillery bombardment, stress fractures in both legs from carrying wounded personnel across approximately 12 kilometers of mountainous terrain under enemy fire. Amanda found herself taking notes frantically, trying to capture details that were completely outside her academic experience. The medical terminology Elena was using suggested injuries that were far more severe and dramatic than anything she had encountered in her theoretical study of veteran healthcare needs. Bethany had gone completely pale as the reality of Elena's service record began to sink in. The woman she had mocked for wearing combat boots to a VA appointment had apparently earned those boots in ways that defied comfortable assumptions about what military service actually involved. Derek's voice, when he finally managed to speak, carried a tremor that revealed how completely his worldview had been shaken. 18 hours? You held a defensive position for 18 hours? Firebase Charlie was overrun at 0347 hours, Elena replied, consulting the medical documentation with the precision of someone recounting events that were permanently embedded in their memory. The evacuation helicopter was shot down during the initial attack. Radio communications were compromised. Standard protocol required holding position until relief forces could reach our location. The Navy veteran had risen from her chair and moved closer to Elena's position, drawn by details that spoke of the kind of heroism that military personnel recognized, but civilians rarely encountered. Her expression carried the particular quality of respect that one combat veteran showed another, tinged with awe at the scope of what Elena was describing. Relief forces? Derek asked, his interrogation having transformed into something approaching desperate curiosity. Elena turned a page in the medical file and indicated a section that documented the final phase of the operation. Relief arrived at 2,215 hours the following day. By that time, the firebase was down to 3 operational personnel and critically low on ammunition. The medical records indicate that I was unconscious when the rescue team arrived, having sustained multiple injuries while maintaining defensive positions and providing medical aid to wounded teammates. The waiting room had become completely silent except for the sound of people breathing. Even the background noise from other parts of the building seemed muted, as if the entire facility was holding its breath while Elena's story unfolded. Amanda's pen had stopped moving across her notepad as she realized that she was witnessing something that would fundamentally change her understanding of military service. veteran experiences, and the dangerous assumptions that civilians made about people, whose stories lay far outside their comfortable academic frameworks. The main entrance doors of the Northridge VA building opened with their characteristic pneumatic hiss, but the "da-gen" sound carried a different weight this time, cutting through the tense atmosphere that had settled over the waiting room like a blade through silk. The man who entered moved with the kind of purposeful authority that caused everyone in the vicinity to automatically straighten their posture, even those who had never served a day in uniform. General William Thornton was not a man who made casual visits to regional VA offices. At 61, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had spent 4 decades in military service, rising through the ranks not through political maneuvering, but through demonstrated competence in situations where failure meant people died. His uniform was impeccable but functional, bearing the 4 stars that marked him as one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. The ribbons on his chest told the story of a career spent in the world's most dangerous places, leading operations that had shaped modern military history. Thornton's presence immediately altered the dynamics of the entire building. The security guard at the entrance snapped to attention with reflexive precision, recognizing authority that transcended any civilian chain of command. Other veterans in the waiting room felt their military training reassert itself, spines straightening, and conversations falling silent as decades-old instincts responded to the proximity of command authority. The general's aide, a sharp-eyed major who followed 3 steps behind and to the right, carried himself with the alert efficiency of someone whose job was to ensure that nothing interfered with his superior's mission. He scanned the room with professional thoroughness, cataloging faces and positions with the automatic awareness that came from years of providing security for high-value personnel in uncertain environments. Derek had frozen completely at his workstation, his mouth slightly open as he tried to process the sudden appearance of a 4-star general in what should have been a routine morning at a regional benefits office. Bethany's hands had moved instinctively to smooth her hair and check her appearance, while Amanda appeared to be trying to make herself invisible behind her LSAT prep books. But General Thornton's attention was focused entirely on the woman standing at window 3, her declassified medical records spread across the counter, her worn combat boots planted firmly on the institutional carpet. His expression shifted through several stages: initial recognition, growing certainty, and finally something that could only be described as profound respect mixed with genuine warmth. "Sergeant Major Vasquez," the general said, his voice carrying easily across the room with the clear diction of someone accustomed to addressing large formations in challenging environments. The title he used caused a ripple of reaction throughout the waiting room, as veterans familiar with military hierarchy understood immediately that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Elena turned from the service window with fluid precision, her posture automatically shifting into a position of respectful attention that spoke of deeply ingrained military discipline. But there was no subservience in her bearing, rather the mutual respect between 2 professionals who had operated at the highest levels of military service. "General Thornton," Elena replied, her voice carrying the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout her interaction with the clerks, but now tinged with the particular quality of recognition that passed between people who had shared experiences beyond civilian understanding. The general stepped forward, closing the distance between them with deliberate intent. "When I heard you were finally accessing VA services, I wanted to personally ensure that your case received the attention it deserves." His words carried weight that transcended their surface meaning, suggesting layers of history and significance that the civilian staff could only guess at. Derek found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "General, I was just processing Ms. Vasquez's disability claim, and there seemed to be some questions about." Thornton's gaze shifted to Derek with the kind of focused attention that made seasoned combat veterans uncomfortable. "Questions?" he repeated, the single word carrying enough authority to make Derek's prepared explanations die in his throat. What exactly are you questioning about Sergeant Major Vasquez's service record? The elderly veteran in the front row had managed to position himself where he could observe the entire interaction, and his expression showed the particular fascination of someone watching military protocol unfold at levels he had rarely witnessed. The woman with the Navy veteran cap had moved closer as well, drawn by the unprecedented nature of seeing a 4-star general personally intervening in a routine benefits appointment. Amanda felt her academic understanding of military hierarchy completely restructure itself as she realized that Elena held a rank that placed her among the most senior enlisted personnel in the entire United States Army. Sergeant Major was not a title that was handed out casually. It represented decades of exceptional service and leadership, responsibilities that civilian institutions rarely encountered. Bethany had abandoned all pretense of normal work and was staring openly at the interaction unfolding before her, beginning to understand that the woman she had dismissed as someone playing dress-up was actually someone whose service record commanded personal attention from the highest levels of military leadership. General Thornton's aide had positioned himself where he could observe the civilian staff while maintaining visual contact with his superior, his professional demeanor suggesting that this visit was more than a casual courtesy call. The presence of a 4-star general at a regional VA office indicated that Elena's case had significance that extended far beyond routine benefit processing. "Sir," Derek attempted, his voice carrying a tremor that revealed how completely out of his depth he felt. "I was just following standard verification procedures for disability claims. Some of the conditions seemed extensive." The general's expression didn't change, but something in the quality of his attention suggested that Derek had just stepped into dangerous territory. "Extensive," Thornton repeated, the word hanging in the air like a challenge. "Are you suggesting that Sergeant Major Vasquez's documented injuries are somehow inconsistent with her service record?" Elena had remained silent during this exchange, her posture relaxed but alert, allowing the general to handle the situation while remaining ready to respond if called upon. Her presence had somehow become more commanding rather than less, as if the arrival of military authority had activated aspects of her personality that civilian interactions didn't require. The waiting room had become completely silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant hum of building systems. Even veterans who had never served in the Army understood that they were witnessing something significant, a 4-star general personally vouching for someone whose service had been questioned by civilian administrators who clearly had no understanding of what they were dealing with. Thornton's next words were delivered with the kind of quiet authority that made them impossible to ignore or forget. "Sergeant Major Vasquez is one of the most decorated enlisted soldiers currently serving in the United States Army. Her service record includes operations that remain classified at the top enlisted soldiers currently serving in the United States Army. Her service record includes operations that remain classified at the highest levels of government. The injuries documented in her disability claim were sustained while saving the lives of American servicemen under circumstances that would challenge the courage of the most experienced combat veterans." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a physical presence, fundamentally altering everyone's understanding of who Elena was and what her quiet presence represented. Derek's prepared questions about fraudulent claims suddenly seemed not just irrelevant, but actively insulting, while Amanda's academic theories about military identity performance revealed themselves as embarrassingly naive. The stage was set for revelations that would complete the transformation of 3 civilian employees' understanding of military service, sacrifice, and the dangerous assumptions they had made about someone whose story transcended anything their comfortable civilian experience had prepared them to recognize. General Thornton stepped closer to the service window, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room as he prepared to deliver information that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the quiet woman who had been subjected to an hour of skeptical interrogation. His voice carried the authority of someone who had briefed presidents and congressional committees on matters of national security. Since there seemed to be questions about Sergeant Major Vasquez's legitimacy, Thornton began, his gaze sweeping across the three civilian clerks with the kind of measured attention that made seasoned officers uncomfortable. Perhaps some context would be helpful for those processing her benefits claim. Derek had shrunk back in his chair, his earlier confidence completely evaporated as he realized that his routine fraud investigation had somehow escalated into a situation involving the highest levels of military command. Bethany's motivational calendar and desk decoration suddenly seemed childish and inappropriate in the presence of someone discussing classified military operations. Amanda had abandoned her LSAT prep materials entirely, recognizing that she was about to receive an education that no political science textbook could have provided. Sergeant Major Vasquez, the general continued, holds the distinction of being the only enlisted soldier in the past 20 years to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Service Cross for actions performed during separate combat operations. The Medal of Honor was awarded for her actions during Operation Mountain Resolve, where she single-handedly held Firebase Charlie against overwhelming enemy forces for 18 hours while providing medical aid to wounded personnel. The elderly veteran in the front row had gone completely rigid in his chair, his weathered hands gripping his cane with white-knuckled intensity. The Medal of Honor was not a decoration that was awarded lightly. It represented the highest level of valor that the United States military could recognize, reserved for actions that went far beyond the call of duty, even in the most extreme circumstances. The Distinguished Service Cross, Thornton continued, was awarded for her actions 6 months later during Operation Silent Thunder, where she led a reconnaissance team behind enemy lines to extract a downed pilot. During that mission, she eliminated 17 enemy combatants while suffering multiple gunshot wounds, ultimately carrying the wounded pilot 12 kilometers through hostile territory to reach the extraction point. Amanda felt her understanding of military heroism completely recalibrate as she realized that the woman she had dismissed as someone engaging in military identity performance had actually performed actions that exceeded anything she had read about in her academic study of combat operations. The gap between theoretical knowledge and lived reality had never been more apparent. Bethany's coffee mug, proclaiming her to be the world's greatest problem solver, seemed to mock her from its position on her desk as she realized that Elena had solved problems that involved life and death decisions under circumstances that civilian problem-solving frameworks couldn't even contemplate. Her comfortable assumptions about what constituted real achievement had been shattered by someone whose accomplishments transcended any civilian equivalent. "The combat boots that your staff found so amusing," General Thornton said, his tone carrying just enough edge to make his disapproval clear, "were worn during both of those operations. They have walked through places that most Americans will never see, carried weight that most people could never bear, and protected feet that have stood ground when retreat would have meant the death of American servicemen." Derek's voice, when he finally managed to speak, came out as barely more than a whisper. "Medal of Honor? But she didn't mention ... Recipients of the Medal of Honor," Elena said quietly, speaking for the first time since the general's arrival, "don't typically announce their decorations during routine administrative appointments. The medal represents actions that most people prefer not to discuss casually." The Navy veteran had moved close enough to see the declassified medical records spread across the counter, and her sharp intake of breath was audible across the room as she recognized the extent of Elena's documented injuries. The medical terminology painted a picture of trauma that went far beyond anything that routine military service typically involved. "General." Thornton reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a folder that bore classification markings indicating It contained information that was normally restricted to the highest levels of government access. These are Elena's complete service records, recently declassified for the purpose of this benefits review. They document 8 years of continuous combat operations in the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan, Iraq, and several locations that remain classified. He opened the folder and removed a photograph that he placed on the counter where the civilian staff could see it. The image showed Elena in full combat gear, standing with a group of soldiers in what was clearly a war zone. Her face was younger, but carried the same calm competence they had witnessed during the morning's interaction. The equipment she wore and the environment visible in the background spoke of operations that were far from routine military service. Elena paused and looked back, her expression reflecting someone who had learned to measure people by their willingness to grow rather than their initial mistakes. Apology accepted. Use this experience to remember that every veteran's story is worth respecting, regardless of how they present themselves or what assumptions their appearance might suggest. General Thornton fell into step beside Elena as they approached the main entrance, their shared presence representing a level of military authority and achievement that civilian institutions rarely encountered. "Sergeant Major," he said as they reached the doors, "your benefits will be expedited through appropriate channels. You've earned better treatment than what you received here today." "Thank you, General," Elena replied. "But today wasn't really about my benefits. Sometimes people need to learn that heroes don't always look like what they expect." The automatic doors slid open with their characteristic hiss, and Elena walked out into the Colorado sunshine, her worn combat boots carrying her toward whatever mission still awaited someone whose service to country continued even in civilian clothes. General Thornton followed, leaving behind a VA office where 3 employees had received an education that would influence every veteran interaction for the rest of their careers. In the waiting room, veterans continued to discuss what they had witnessed, sharing stories and perspectives that emphasized the day's central lesson about respect, assumption, and the dangerous tendency to judge people based on appearance rather than substance. The morning had become something that would be remembered and retold, a story about the heroes who walk among us every day, wearing worn boots and carrying quiet dignity that reveals itself only when circumstances demand recognition of true service. Derek, Bethany, and Amanda would spend the rest of their careers remembering the day they learned that questioning someone's legitimacy based on assumptions could lead to discovering that the person they doubted was actually someone whose achievements exceeded anything their civilian experience had prepared them to recognize. The lesson would make them better at their jobs and more respectful of the people they served, but it would also serve as a permanent reminder of how much they had misunderstood about courage, sacrifice, and the difference between playing a role and earning one through blood and dedication. Have you ever encountered someone you completely misjudged? Someone whose quiet strength and worn appearance concealed achievements that would humble the most accomplished person? What would you have done if you'd seen those combat boots? Would you have recognized them for the symbols of service they truly were? Or would you have made the same assumptions that nearly cost 3 civil servants their understanding of what real heroism looks like? Let us know in the comments below. Hit that like button if this story reminded you that true heroes often wear humble faces and carry their achievements quietly. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss these powerful stories about the veterans who walk among us every day, earning our respect through their actions rather than demanding it through their appearance. Share this with someone who thinks they know what a war hero looks like. More stories like this are waiting for you. Check out our playlist and discover the courage hiding in plain sight. We'll see you tomorrow, right here on Heroes Among Us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.